She spent 20 years writing tickets on real mariners, and if you think I will ever let a clipboard sailor touch this company, you are out of your mind. My father-in-law smiled when he said it, sliding a stack of hostile succession papers across the dining room table toward my husband. He was absolutely certain I was just a bureaucratic nuisance. To understand how that arrogant smirk vanished months later inside a downtown deposition room, and how a dusty federal safety file proved I was the exact reason his marina still existed, I have to take you back. My name is Elena. I am 54 years old. Before I took off the uniform, I spent 22 years in the United States Coast Guard, retiring as a chief warrant officer. Today, I work as a civilian marine safety investigator for a federal maritime agency out of Norfolk, Virginia. My days do not look like a recruiting commercial. I do not drop from rescue helicopters into towering winter swells to pull freezing people from sinking boats. I spend my time crawling through cramped engine rooms. I inspect oily bilges on commercial tugs. I look for microscopic stress fractures in steel bulkheads, and I verify fire suppression systems on massive cargo vessels. My mission has always been simple: stop the casualty before the ship ever leaves the pier. I operate on facts over feelings. The ocean does not care about your ego. The ocean does not care about your profit margin. Slow is smooth, and smooth is fast. 5 years ago, I married into a family that ran on a completely different current. My husband, Mark, is a brilliant, steady man. He is the logistics expert and the financial anchor of a massive coastal marina and boat repair business situated right off the Chesapeake Bay. But marrying Mark meant dealing with his father, Arthur. Arthur owned the marina. He built it from a single, sagging wooden dock in the late 1970s into a multi-million-dollar empire. He possessed 3 heavy-lift cranes, dozens of deep water slips, and a repair facility that serviced entire fleets of commercial crab boats. He was loud, demanding, and utterly convinced his way was the only way. Arthur viewed safety regulations as an insult to his intelligence. To him, federal inspectors were just government parasites trying to steal money from real, hard-working men. From the first time we met, he made his opinion of me incredibly clear. He assumed I was just a paper pusher. He loved to stand on the concrete pier with his mechanics, a ceramic mug of black coffee in his hand, and tell them that his new daughter-in-law was a fake sailor. He called me a clipboard captain. He told his friends my only skill was writing expensive tickets to honest fishermen over expired emergency flares. I never argued with him. Not because I agreed with him, because I knew exactly who I was. I had stood on the decks of burned-out hulls. I had seen the tragic cost when arrogant men ignore safety protocols. Sometimes you demand respect from a bully. Sometimes you just let an angry man yell at the tide. I chose to keep the peace for Mark. Mark was the true engine of the family business. While Arthur shouted at vendors, Mark sat in a cramped office handling the massive payroll, balancing the crushing commercial insurance premiums, and keeping the state environmental regulators happy. It was an unspoken, universally accepted fact that when Arthur eventually retired, Mark would inherit the company. But as Arthur crossed into his late 70s, his physical strength started to fade. He could no longer walk the docks for 12 hours a day. Therefore, as his physical control slipped, his psychological grip became a vice. He grew intensely paranoid. He developed a towering, irrational obsession with me. He convinced himself that I was secretly plotting to seize control of the marina the moment he stepped down. In his mind, I was waiting in the shadows, ready to turn his rugged boatyard into a sterile, rule-bound federal facility. It was a complete fabrication. I had my own federal pension and a career I loved. I had zero interest in running his business. But Arthur's paranoia escalated into aggression. He started isolating Mark. He left him off critical emails regarding vendor contracts. He held private meetings with his bank manager in downtown Norfolk and deliberately told the yard foreman not to update my husband on the maintenance schedules. When Mark asked him why he was being sidelined, Arthur would brush him off. He claimed Mark did not understand the big picture. I told Mark to start quietly documenting the changes. I told him to secure his own files. He thought I was overreacting. He thought his father was just struggling with the reality of getting older. Then came the dinner. It was a Tuesday evening in late October. A cold autumn wind was whipping off the bay, rattling the porch light outside Arthur's sprawling waterfront home. He invited us over for what he promised was a standard end-of-year tax discussion. The meal was silent and tense. Arthur barely touched his roast beef. As soon as the plates were cleared, he reached under the heavy oak dining table. He pulled out a thick, legal-sized folder. He tossed it onto the polished wood. The heavy thud echoed in the quiet room. Mark looked at the folder. He asked what it was. Arthur did not look at him. He looked directly at me. His eyes were perfectly cold. He told Mark they were irrevocable trust modifications. He had quietly hired a corporate attorney to draft a new operating agreement. The papers legally mandated that Mark could only inherit his shares of the marina if he signed a binding spousal exclusion waiver. It was an ironclad cage. It was designed to permanently bar me from holding any financial stake, any voting power, or any advisory role in the company forever. If Mark refused to sign it by Friday, Arthur declared he would transfer ownership to a hostile board of directors made up of his old friends. Mark would be stripped of his executive authority and forced out of the business he had spent his life building. Then he leaned back in his chair and delivered the line. She spent 20 years writing tickets on real mariners, and if you think I will ever let a clipboard sailor touch this company, you are out of your mind. He smiled. He thought he had outmaneuvered us. He thought he had trapped a weak bureaucrat forcing his own son to choose between his inheritance and his wife. The silence in the dining room felt heavy enough to crack the floorboards. Mark stared at the thick legal folder, then up at his father. The betrayal was absolute. He had given 25 years to that boatyard. He had missed vacations, worked 80-hour weeks in the freezing rain, and covered for his father's chaotic management style just to keep the gates open. Now his inheritance was being held hostage, and my permanent exclusion was the ransom. Arthur sat back waiting for the explosion. He wanted me to scream. He wanted me to curse at him and storm out, proving his narrative that I was an aggressive, unstable woman trying to steal his legacy. I did not give him the satisfaction. When you spend your life investigating marine casualties, you learn a vital truth. Panic is a choice. Anger blinds you to the layout of the room. I did not raise my voice. I simply stood up, told Mark I would wait in the truck, and walked out the front door. The drive home was suffocating. Mark gripped the steering wheel so hard his knuckles were stark white in the dash lights. He was grieving the father he thought he knew. When we got to our kitchen, he slumped into a chair. If he signed the waiver, he surrendered our marriage to his father's paranoia. If he refused, he lost the only career he had ever known. I told him not to make a decision in the dark. We would wait. But Arthur was not waiting. By Wednesday morning, the real pressure campaign began. Arthur did not just want to legally freeze me out. He wanted to socially annihilate us on the waterfront. When Mark arrived at the yard at 6 a.m, his key card flashed red. The locks on the main office had already been changed. Arthur had called a mandatory meeting in the maintenance bay. He stood on a wooden pallet and told his crew of 40 mechanics and riggers that big changes were coming. He painted a completely fabricated narrative. He told them I was secretly orchestrating a hostile corporate takeover. He claimed I was using my federal background to dig up environmental violations with the ultimate goal of shutting the yard down and selling the property to luxury condominium developers. It was an absurd lie. But fear is a highly effective weapon. The men in that yard depended on their weekly paychecks to feed their families. When the owner tells them the owner's daughter-in-law is coming for their jobs, loyalty fractures instantly. Mark spent the rest of the day fielding angry phone calls. The senior mechanic stopped answering his radio checks. Longtime vendors suddenly demanded cash on delivery. Arthur was deliberately strangling the daily operations just to force Mark into submission. He wanted the pressure to be so unbearable that Mark would crawl back, sign the exclusion waiver, and throw me to the wolves. That evening, Mark paced our living room. The stress was physically aging him. He stopped by the window, looking out at the rain. He quietly asked if he should just sign the papers. He said it was just a legal fiction, a piece of paper to keep his father calm. I walked over and stood beside him, not because I cared about the money, because I knew the waiver was not the end. It was a test. If Mark caved to extortion now, Arthur would never stop. He would leverage the threat of the hostile board to control every decision Mark ever made. I told Mark we were not fighting on his father's terms. When an adversary relies on brute force, you do not meet them in the center of the ring. You look for the blind spot. Overconfident men always leave a trail. Arthur was moving too fast. His sudden, desperate need to lock me out of the company's inner workings felt incredibly defensive. He was terrified of me. Not because of what I might do in the future, but because of what I represented. I was a federal safety investigator. I asked Mark to think about the business. Arthur claimed he was a self-made titan who never made a mistake. But no one runs a heavy industrial maritime facility for 40 years without a crisis. I needed to know where the bodies were buried. I asked Mark who handled the deep historical archives for the marina. Not the daily payroll, but the heavy liability documents. The state environmental filings. Mark rubbed his eyes. He said the external accountant, a quiet man named Thomas, kept the master files at a secure off-site office downtown. Thomas was a meticulous bookkeeper who had managed the numbers since the 1990s. He hated Arthur's explosive temper, but he deeply respected Mark. I told my husband to call Thomas. Mark hesitated. He said Thomas was terrified of losing the marina contract. I told Mark this was not about getting involved in a family fight. This was about survival. Mark dialed the number. When Thomas answered, his voice was hushed. He told Mark that Arthur had been calling him all day, demanding he prepare the current financial ledgers for the new hostile board of directors. I leaned closer to the phone. I introduced myself. I asked Thomas a very specific question. I did not want the current trust documents. I wanted the history. I asked if he still had access to the commercial liability insurance audits from the past 20 years. Insurance premiums are the absolute pulse of a maritime business. When everything is smooth, the premiums are stable. When something catastrophic happens, the premiums skyrocket. A massive spill or a structural failure will cause a carrier to drop you entirely. Thomas went dead silent on the line. The hesitation was thick. Finally, Thomas admitted he still had the old paper records. He said they were boxed up in a damp storage unit on the edge of town, untouched for years. Arthur had forbidden anyone from looking at them, claiming they were irrelevant history. I told Thomas we needed to see them. I sensed a massive discrepancy in the way Arthur operated, and the proof was hiding in that unit. I asked Thomas to meet us there first thing in the morning. The storage unit was a featureless cinder block building sitting in a gravel lot on the industrial edge of Norfolk. Thursday morning was bleak and cold. The sky was the color of wet cement. Thomas was already there when Mark and I pulled up. The accountant looked small inside his heavy trench coat, clutching a ring of brass keys. He glanced over his shoulder twice before rolling up the heavy metal door. The space inside was crammed from the cold concrete floor to the tin roof, with stacked white banker boxes, all faintly yellowed from decades of coastal humidity. Before we stepped inside, Thomas hesitated. He looked at Mark. He warned my husband that if Arthur found out we were in this unit, Mark would be permanently disowned by the end of the day. Mark did not waver. He told Thomas that his father had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. Mark said he was never going to sign the spousal exclusion waiver. He was not going to surrender our marriage just to keep a job. He was standing with me entirely and absolutely. That quiet declaration of loyalty anchored the room. Mark was choosing us. We walked into the damp air. I told Thomas we were looking for a specific disruption. I needed the commercial insurance audits from the past 2 decades. When you investigate a marine casualty, you do not start by asking the captain what happened. You follow the damage. The same is true for corporate records. We spent the next 2 hours hauling heavy boxes onto a folding table we found near the door. Mark and Thomas sorted through endless stacks of mundane tax returns, dock lease agreements, and minor injury reports. I focused solely on the hazard policies. For a long time, everything looked perfectly normal. The business had grown steadily, the premiums were stable with only minor adjustments for inflation. Then I opened a box labeled 2004. I pulled out a thick black binder and ran my finger down the primary summary page. I stopped. I tapped a faded line item and called Mark and Thomas over. The numbers did not make any sense. In the span of a single month in the spring of 2004, the marina's primary commercial liability policy had spiked by 400%. A secondary hazard policy had been completely canceled by the carrier. Mark leaned over the table, his brow furrowing. He had been managing the day-to-day yard operations back then, but Arthur had always kept total control over the executive finances. Mark had no idea the business had ever taken a financial hit that massive. I asked Thomas what caused the spike. Thomas wiped a bead of sweat from his forehead. He said, 2004 was the year the business almost vanished overnight. He explained that Arthur had always run the heavy lift cranes and the commercial fueling docks right on the edge of disaster. He delayed maintenance to save money. He bypassed safety interlocks. But his biggest secret was the primary underground diesel transfer line. Thomas lowered his voice. He said Arthur had ignored repeated warnings from his own mechanics that the high-pressure steel pipes were heavily degraded. They were buried under the main concrete pier right next to the primary electrical transformers for the yard. Then came the federal inspection. Arthur loved to tell the story of the meddling government inspector who almost ruined his life. He claimed a rogue government agent had showed up unannounced, fabricated a massive list of imaginary violations out of pure malice, and tried to shut the marina down. Arthur fought the citation bitterly. He refused to fix the line. He claimed the inspector was an incompetent bureaucrat. But the federal agency did not back down. They issued a mandatory immediate stop work order. They legally chained the fuel pumps and threatened to revoke the operating license entirely unless the system was excavated and replaced to strict federal standards. Arthur was forced to comply. The massive excavation nearly bankrupted the company. That was why the insurance spiked. The forced compliance cost Arthur everything he had in the bank. But the story did not end there. Thomas looked grim. He said 6 months after the new pipes were finally installed during a massive winter squall, a power surge caused one of the primary transformers on the pier to explode. The blast shattered windows in the main office and started a massive electrical fire right on the concrete dock. Mark remembered the fire. He said the flames were 40 feet high, but they managed to extinguish the blaze before it reached the boats. Thomas shook his head. He said it was not luck. He looked directly at my husband. He said if that underground fuel line had still been leaking, if the high-pressure system had still been compromised the way it was before the forced repair, the transformer explosion would have ignited the entire subterranean fuel farm. The blast would have leveled the entire marina. It would have killed the night crew. The ensuing environmental disaster in the bay would have resulted in federal criminal charges, and Arthur would have gone to prison. The forced repair saved everything. The meddling inspector the bureaucrat Arthur hated with every fiber of his being had literally stopped a catastrophe. Arthur never admitted it. He buried the truth. He spun the narrative, turning himself into the victim, and spent the next 2 decades telling everyone that safety regulations were a scam. I stood in the dusty unit, staring at the financial ledger. I asked Thomas if he had the actual citation. I wanted to see the federal incident report. I wanted to know exactly who this inspector was and what specific details they had logged. Thomas hesitated. He said Arthur had ordered him to destroy the original federal paperwork years ago. I asked Thomas if he actually did it. A quiet, rebellious smile crossed the accountant's face. Accountants never throw away original documents. Thomas reached into the very back of the banker box. He dug past a layer of old tax receipts. He pulled out a faded, water-damaged manila folder. The edges were curled and brittle. He walked back to the folding table. He set the heavy folder down, sliding it across the dusty surface toward me. The air in the storage unit smelled like coastal salt and decaying paper. I rested my hand on the curled manila folder. I opened the cover. Inside was a complete, original carbon copy of a United States Coast Guard Marine Safety Inspection Report. The top corner carried the faded outline of the federal seal. The date was April 12th, 2004. I scanned the heavy block text. The violation narrative was meticulous. It detailed catastrophic degradation in the subterranean diesel transfer manifold. It noted a high probability of structural failure near active ignition sources. The mandatory corrective action demanded an immediate halt to all fueling operations and a total replacement of the primary infrastructure. The logic was cold, precise, and unyielding. It was the exact type of report I taught junior investigators how to write. I kept reading. I moved past the technical specifications down to the bottom of the page. I checked the signature block to see who had issued the massive citation. I stopped breathing. I stared at the black ink. I stared at the name, the rank, and the agency identification number stamped below the signature line. I closed my eyes. I opened them again. The ink had not changed. Mark noticed the sudden shift in my posture. He stepped closer, maneuvering around a stack of boxes. He asked what was wrong. I turned the folder around so it faced my husband. I pointed to the signature at the bottom of the page. Mark leaned in, squinting in the dim light. He read the name aloud. Chief Warrant Officer Elena Rostova. Before I married Mark, my last name was Rostova. 20 years ago, I was a young, newly promoted warrant officer stationed in the Norfolk sector. I was strict, uncompromising, and absolutely dedicated to the safety manual. I was the meddling inspector. I was the bureaucrat Arthur hated. I was the government agent who chained his pumps, forced the massive repair, and inadvertently prevented the transformer fire from vaporizing his entire livelihood. I had completely forgotten about the incident. When you perform hundreds of high-stakes vessel and facility inspections across decades of military service, the individual names and faces blur together. To me, the marina was just another Tuesday enforcing the federal code. Arthur was just another angry owner who refused to respect the ocean. I had no idea the hostile, arrogant man I cited 20 years ago was the man who would eventually become my father-in-law. The silence in the room was absolute. Thomas was staring at me, his mouth slightly open. He looked from the document to my face and back to the document. Mark was frozen. He realized the magnitude of what we were looking at. His father had spent years verbally abusing me. Arthur had called me a useless paper pusher. He had mocked me as a fake mariner who obstructed real work. And yet, this piece of paper proved that his business, his wealth, and his entire legacy only existed because of me. If Arthur knew this, the psychological devastation would be total. Mark looked at me, a dangerous light sparking in his eyes. He said we needed to take the folder and drive straight to Arthur's house. He wanted to throw the carbon copy on the dining room table and watch his father choke on his own arrogance. I closed the folder. I told Mark we were not doing that. Not because I did not want to see Arthur humbled, because a private confrontation in a living room accomplishes nothing. Arthur would just tear the paper up. He would call it a forgery. He would find a way to manipulate the truth and twist the narrative again, claiming the fire was never a real threat and that I was just trying to steal credit for his hard work. I told my husband that if we were going to expose Arthur, we were going to do it on the record. We were going to do it where the lies carried legal consequences. Arthur had built a trap for us, and I was going to let him spring it. I told Thomas to put the original file back in the box. I told him to lock the unit and act exactly as he had before. I did not want Arthur to know a thing. I drove home and immediately logged into my federal personnel portal. The carbon copy in the storage unit was strong evidence, but I wanted the ironclad proof. I requested a certified official copy of the 2004 incident report directly from the agency archives in Washington. When a federal document is certified, it is stamped and authenticated by the government. It cannot be legally challenged as a forgery. While I waited for the certified copy to arrive, the pressure from Arthur reached its boiling point. Friday morning arrived. The deadline to sign the spousal exclusion waiver. Mark ignored Arthur's phone calls. He did not show up at the marina. He did not sign a single document. At noon, a courier knocked on our front door. He handed Mark a heavy envelope from Arthur's corporate law firm. Arthur had executed his threat. The legal notice formally announced that Arthur was transferring immediate controlling interest of the marina to the hostile board of directors. Furthermore, Arthur was filing an aggressive civil suit against Mark, demanding full repayment of years of alleged financial mismanagement. It was a scorched earth tactic designed to utterly ruin my husband. But buried deep in the aggressive legal language was the critical detail I was waiting for. Arthur's attorneys demanded a mandatory sworn deposition from Mark to investigate his influence over the company finances. They were forcing my husband to testify under oath on camera in a downtown law office. Arthur wanted to publicly humiliate Mark, drag my name through the mud on the official record, and cement his narrative that I was a destructive force. Arthur's legal team thought they were setting a brilliant trap to crush us. They had absolutely no idea what they were walking into. The certified federal documents arrived on a Tuesday, delivered by priority registered mail directly from the agency archives in Washington. I stood at my kitchen island and opened the heavy, tamper-proof envelope. The document inside was pristine. The stiff paper bore the raised, embossed seal of the United States government, flanked by authentication ribbons. It was a flawless, legally binding copy of the citation I had written 20 years earlier. The signature block was sharp. The mandatory repair order was undeniable. I slid the certified record into a slim black leather portfolio. I was ready. Over the next 3 weeks, as we waited for the deposition date, Arthur's behavior became unbearable. He was absolutely convinced he had won. The waterfront rumor mill runs faster than a storm surge. Mechanics from the yard called Mark constantly, saying Arthur was holding court at the local diner every morning. He was buying breakfast for his old cronies and boasting loudly that he was finally purging the weak links from his empire. He told everyone that Mark was going to crack under the pressure of a sworn legal proceeding. He promised his friends that the official record would expose me as a manipulative, incompetent fraud who had tried to steal what real men built. Arthur's arrogance was towering, but it was built entirely on a foundation of sand. Mark found the waiting incredibly difficult. Every time a marine vendor cut off our credit or a former friend ignored us at the grocery store, the urge to strike back flared up in my husband. He wanted to drive down to the marina, kick open the door to the main office, and wave the federal report in his father's face. I told him to hold the line. When you investigate major marine casualties, you learn that premature action is what sinks the ship. You do not deploy the life rafts while the vessel is still making way. You wait for the exact right moment. I reminded Mark of the investigator's code. When a hostile witness is confidently giving a false statement, you do not interrupt them. You let them talk. You let them build a massive, intricate structure of lies, because the bigger the structure, the harder it collapses when you remove the foundation block. Arthur was aggressively broadcasting his narrative because he desperately needed people to believe it. He assumed we had absolutely no leverage. He assumed we were walking into the deposition completely defenseless. We needed a navigator to help spring the trap. We hired a brilliant, quiet attorney named Hayes to represent Mark. Hayes was a retired Navy judge advocate general. He possessed a sharp analytical mind, he understood military records implicitly, and he had zero tolerance for corporate bullies. We met in his modest office on a rainy Wednesday afternoon. Mark and I sat across from his desk. I unzipped my leather portfolio, pulled out the certified federal incident report, and slid it across the desk. Hayes read it in complete silence. He looked at the date. He read the catastrophic damage assessment. He traced the raised federal seal with his thumb. Then he looked up at me. He asked if Arthur's corporate lawyers had any idea that I was the inspecting officer who had chained his fuel pumps in 2004. I told Hayes that Arthur barely looked at me during family dinners, let alone remembered the name of a young Coast Guard warrant officer from 2 decades ago. To Arthur, I was just a nameless government parasite. His highly paid legal team was flying completely blind, building their entire civil suit on the core assumption that I was a useless paper pusher with no real connection to the maritime industry. A slow, calculating smile spread across the attorney's face. Hayes slid the certified report back to me. He told us exactly how the deposition would run. Arthur's corporate lawyers would attack Mark's financial decisions, but Arthur's ego was his fatal flaw. Arthur would not be able to resist taking the deposition off the rails to complain about me. He would try to use the sworn record to solidify his narrative that I was a destructive force. Hayes told us that in a civil deposition, the opposing counsel sets the perimeter, but a prepared witness controls the high ground. Our strategy was simple. We would give Arthur all the slack he wanted. We would let him commit perjury on the official video record before we revealed a single card. The morning of the deposition arrived with a heavy coastal fog. The air was damp and clinging to the windshield as Mark and I drove into downtown Norfolk. The venue was Arthur's corporate law firm, situated in a towering glass and steel high-rise that dominated the city skyline. We parked in the subterranean garage and walked into a lobby made of polished marble and chrome. It was a building designed to intimidate. It was meant to make you feel small. I did not feel small. I felt like I was walking onto my own ship. We met Hayes near the elevators. He was wearing a dark, conservative suit carrying a battered leather briefcase. He nodded to Mark, then looked at me. He told me to stay composed, no matter what Arthur said. The truth does not need to shout. We rode the silent elevator up to the 40th floor. The doors parted with a soft chime. A young paralegal escorted us down a long hallway, our footsteps muffled by the thick carpet. She stopped in front of heavy double oak doors and pushed them open. The conference room was vast and intimidating. It was dominated by a massive mahogany table. The floor-to-ceiling windows offered a sweeping view of the gray expanse of the harbor below. Arthur was already there. He sat at the head of the table, flanked by 3 expensive corporate lawyers in pristine suits. A court reporter was setting up a stenography machine, and a videographer was adjusting the frame of a digital camera. Arthur leaned back in his heavy leather chair. He wore a crisp navy blazer, looking perfectly at ease, like a king preparing to banish a peasant. When he saw Mark and me walk through the doors, a smug, victorious smile spread across his face. He thought we were walking into his trap. He thought I was just a clipboard sailor ready to be humiliated. He had absolutely no idea what was waiting for him inside the black portfolio I set gently on the table. The videographer slated the date and time for the official record. The red recording light on the digital camera clicked on, glowing steadily in the corner of the silent conference room. The court reporter positioned her hands over her steno machine. The deposition was underway. Arthur's lead corporate lawyer was a sharp, aggressive man named Sterling. He wore an expensive gray suit and possessed the polished, impatient tone of a man who was used to bullying small business owners into quick settlements. For the first 2 hours, Sterling methodically interrogated my husband. He attacked Mark's financial stewardship. He fired off questions about minor accounting discrepancies, routine maintenance delays, and standard vendor contracts. The goal was obvious. Sterling was trying to build a legal foundation to prove that Mark was incompetent, thereby justifying Arthur's hostile takeover of the family trust. Mark did not take the bait. He remained incredibly composed. He answered every question with cold, factual precision, relying entirely on the meticulously kept operational logs. He did not raise his voice. He did not let the lawyer's aggressive pacing rattle him. Arthur sat at the head of the heavy mahogany table, growing visibly frustrated. The slow, methodical pace of the financial interrogation was not what he wanted. He was not interested in a debate over ledger entries. He wanted a public execution. He wanted Mark to crack under the pressure, and he wanted me to lose my temper. As the clock neared noon, Arthur's ego could not take being a spectator any longer. He ignored a sharp warning glance from Sterling and leaned heavily forward. Arthur interrupted his own attorney mid-sentence. He glared across the table at Mark, then pointed a thick, accusatory finger directly at me. He loudly declared for the sworn record that the financial ledgers were a distraction. He stated that the real threat to the marina was the woman sitting across from him. He claimed that I was a manipulative, destructive presence who had brainwashed his son. Sterling tried to gently steer his client back to the civil suit, but Arthur was completely untethered. He turned his attention directly to the camera lens. He wanted his hatred permanently etched into the legal record. He went on a blistering, unprompted tirade. He testified under oath that I was a fake mariner, a useless clipboard sailor who had never contributed a single thing of value to the maritime industry. He proudly declared that he had built a massive coastal empire entirely on his own, without ever needing help from a meddling government bureaucrat. He swore that my complete lack of real-world experience proved I was a danger to his company. Arthur leaned back in his heavy leather chair. He looked incredibly satisfied. He thought he had just delivered the killing blow to our defense. Hayes, our attorney, sat perfectly still. He let the echo of Arthur's lies fade into the heavy silence of the expensive room. He looked at the court reporter and quietly asked her to confirm that Arthur's statements were fully recorded. She nodded. Then Hayes calmly unclasped the brass latches of his battered briefcase. He reached for the black leather portfolio I had placed on the table. He opened it and retrieved the certified federal incident report. He did not hand it to Sterling. He slid the pristine, heavily embossed document directly down the center of the mahogany table. It came to rest exactly in front of Arthur. Hayes formally requested that the document be entered into the record as the primary exhibit. Sterling frowned. He leaned over and looked at the document. He scanned the first page, expecting a mundane financial receipt. But as his eyes tracked the heavy block text of the catastrophic damage assessment, the confident lawyer suddenly stopped reading. He looked at the raised federal seal. He saw the mandatory repair order that had nearly bankrupted his client 20 years ago. Sterling instantly recognized a lethal piece of paper. He tensed, looking at his client. Hayes folded his hands on the table. He did not raise his voice. He kept his tone perfectly level, like a judge issuing a final sentence. He asked Arthur if he recognized the citation. Arthur scoffed. He barely glanced at the paper. He sneered, telling the room that it was just an ancient, ridiculous citation from an incompetent inspector who had tried to shut him down over a fabricated fuel leak 2 decades ago. Hayes nodded slowly. He asked Arthur to confirm that 6 months after that forced repair, A massive electrical transformer exploded on his main concrete dock. Arthur shifted uncomfortably. He muttered a reluctant agreement, claiming his crew put the fire out quickly. Hayes leaned forward. He asked Arthur to state under oath what would have happened if the original degraded fuel lines had still been active during that explosion. The room went completely silent. The court reporter stopped typing. Arthur swallowed hard. The arrogant bluster vanished. He knew the truth. If I had not chained those pumps, his marina would have been a smoking crater. He would have been criminally charged for the environmental disaster. He would be sitting in a federal prison. Arthur refused to answer. He crossed his arms and stared at the wall. Sterling looked confused by the strategy. He asked Hayes what a 20-year-old safety report had to do with his client's current lawsuit. Hayes ignored the corporate lawyer. He kept his eyes locked on Arthur. He pointed to the bottom of the certified document. He politely asked Arthur to read the name of the inspecting officer printed in the signature block. Arthur rolled his eyes, exasperated. He put on his reading glasses. He looked down at the paper. I watched the color completely drain from his face. The arrogant, untouchable patriarch was suddenly paralyzed. His jaw tightened. His eyes darted from the black ink to my face and back to the black ink. Hayes did not wait. He read the name aloud for the record. Chief Warrant Officer Elena Rostova. Hayes looked at Sterling. He stated for the record that Elena Rostova was my maiden name. Hayes turned his attention back to Arthur. He stated clearly that the woman Arthur had just spent the last 10 minutes calling a useless, destructive, fake mariner was in fact the exact and only reason his business was not vaporized 20 years ago. He stated that Arthur owed his wealth, his legacy, and his freedom entirely to me. Arthur's mouth hung open. The realization hit him with the force of a tidal wave. The man who was never short of an insult was reduced to a sputtering, terrified old man in front of his own, highly paid legal team. Sterling slammed his notebook shut. The expensive corporate shark realized his client had just committed massive perjury, and their entire civil suit was instantly obliterated. He frantically waved his hands, demanding the videographer cut the feed. He demanded an immediate emergency recess. The red light on the camera died. The deposition was over. The trap had closed perfectly. Arthur's corporate lawyers scrambled to pack their briefcases. The aggressive energy in the room had completely evaporated. Sterling, the primary attorney, did not even look at my husband as he grabbed Arthur by the arm and quickly escorted the old man out of the heavy double oak doors. They retreated down the hallway, desperately trying to figure out how to salvage the wreckage of their own trap. Mark and I stood up. We walked out of the towering glass building and back out onto the damp streets of downtown Norfolk. The coastal fog was finally burning off. The air smelled like salt and wet asphalt. For the first time in months, my husband took a long, deep breath. He squeezed my hand. The crushing weight he had been carrying was finally gone. The legal fallout was immediate and absolute. Sterling realized that any attempt to push the hostile takeover forward would result in us exposing Arthur's massive perjury in an open civil court. 3 days after the deposition, Arthur's legal team formally withdrew the civil suit against my husband. They completely abandoned the hostile board of directors. The ironclad spousal exclusion waiver was fed into a paper shredder. When an arrogant man loses his illusion of absolute control, the collapse is incredibly fast. We held all the leverage. Mark could have demanded anything. He could have taken total punitive control of the marina. He could have forced his father entirely out of the company, leaving Arthur with nothing but a shattered reputation on the waterfront. We could have done exactly what Arthur falsely accused us of doing. We chose a different heading, not because Arthur deserved mercy, because vengeance is a terrible anchor. If you sink an adversary purely out of spite, you have to stay down in the dark water with them to ensure they drown. I had absolutely no desire to run a commercial boatyard. I had my own federal pension, my own career, and a mission I loved. I just wanted the man I loved to be free from his father's toxic control. Mark had our attorney, Hayes, draft a new non-negotiable operating agreement. Arthur was allowed to retain his ceremonial title as the founder, and he kept his retirement stipend. But he was permanently stripped of all executive voting power. Mark assumed total, unquestioned control of the daily operations and all financial decisions. I was officially recognized as an equal partner in the family trust. I demanded only the respect of a seat at the table. Arthur rarely visits the marina now. When he does, he stays quiet. He sits on a wooden bench near the heavy lift cranes, drinking his black coffee, and watches his son manage the cruise. He never calls me a clipboard sailor anymore. He knows exactly who I am, and he knows exactly what his empire owes me. Mark overhauled the safety protocols. The commercial insurance premiums dropped significantly. Under his steady leadership, the yard grew stronger and more profitable than it had ever been. As for me, I kept my federal job. I still drive down to the sprawling commercial piers in the early morning light. I still put on my heavy coveralls. I still crawl through cramped, oily bilges, and I still inspect fire suppression systems on massive cargo vessels. I enforce the safety code because the ocean does not care about your ego, and the truth always surfaces eventually. Sometimes the biggest victories are not won by shouting down a bully. Sometimes the most devastating response to arrogance is a quiet refusal to panic. When someone builds an empire on a foundation of lies, you do not need to bring a wrecking ball. You just need to find the truth they buried and let the weight of their own ego bring the structure down. They will underestimate you. They will dismiss the steady professionals as bureaucratic nuisances. But facts do not care about a fabricated narrative. Have you ever faced a moment where an arrogant authority figure tried to completely rewrite your history to make you look small? How did you quietly hold your ground when the pressure was highest? Let me know your story down in the comments because I review every single one. If you respect a calm victory built on facts and discipline, consider hitting the subscribe button to support the channel. Next time, I will tell you the story of a retired military nurse who uncovered a shocking medical billing fraud at an elite private hospital, and how she used a single discarded patient chart to bring the entire executive board to their knees. Until then, keep your files straight and keep a steady hand on the wheel.